Every person in this room has the perfect motive.
Stand back!
For murder.
What do you mean? Murder.
The 1985 movie Clue is an interesting watch for a couple of reasons. For one, it's a murder mystery based on the board game Cluedo and features a number of spirited performances from well-known actors. But what really stands out about this movie now was the unusual manner in which it was released. 3 different versions with 3 different endings were all screened across America, with the identity of the killer changing in each individual one, including a version where nearly every character is somehow the murderer. This was, of course, all done to keep the identity of the killer unknown. It stands as one of the most impressively elaborate and creative lengths a license holder has gone in keeping their audience unspoiled. And the reason I bring this up now is that if we fast forward a couple of decades, we can see license holders taking similar, if far less creative and admirable approaches to keep their properties unspoiled. Take Atlas, for example, publisher of the hotly anticipated Persona 5, which released to throngs of positive reviews and impressive sales figures. Right up until Atlas America released a statement claiming that anyone who uploaded footage past a certain point or that revealed key plot elements would face DMCA takedowns and risk the closure of their YouTube channel. The supposed reasoning behind these threats was to ensure that its audience remained unspoiled. While I feel Atlas is being more than a little shady with its motives here, it also does raise an interesting question, and that is, how much exactly does prior knowledge and context affect our enjoyment of a narrative? Or, to put it another way, do spoilers ruin stories? I think the gut answer for most people is going to be yes, spoilers are the worst. There's nothing quite like the feeling of having a major moment of a story pulled away from you, the potential shock and awe of such an experience now lost forever. And I think this is something that most everyone has experience in. Given the freeform nature of modern day information, it can feel nearly impossible to avoid spoilers on any level. And this has resulted in what can only be described as spoiler culture. And there are those that will argue that this isn't a bad thing. That given the utter glut of media that's now released nowadays, we need as much information as possible about something in order to confidently commit our time and money to it. Just look at all the amazing must-play games that have released so far this year, meaning that the financial and temporal cost of experiencing all of them is practically impossible for the average consumer. And so the counter-argument is that we need compelling reasons to help us decide which are truly worth our very limited time and money. And for those arguments to truly be made, information is often required that could be considered spoilery. And on the outset of writing this video, I was in 2 minds about this. On one hand, I hate the feeling of having a big moment spoiled, but on the other, I can think of several instances where major spoilers actually led me to watching or playing something I otherwise wouldn't. I'd never have checked out K-On! If I hadn't first watched Digibro's extensive K-On! A Loving Thesis, in which he breaks down the entire show episode by episode. And as it turned out, this was just the context I needed to know that I would probably enjoy this show, despite how far outside my usual strike zone it was. And so, do spoilers hurt or do they help? The inherent problem with this question is that we can never really know for sure. We can never exist in a Schrodinger's cat state where we have both experienced a piece of media, spoiled and unspoiled, because once you commit to one path, you'll never really know what you would have felt on the other. And so, as we often do when things get a little tricky, we turn to science, which leads us to a 2011 study carried out by Nicholas Christianfield, professor of psychology at the University of California. A total of 819 people were given 12 classical short stories, and among roughly half the test subjects, a spoiler paragraph explaining the broad strokes of the story's plot was added to the start of the essay. The readers were then asked to rate each story on a scale of 1 to 10, and the scores were then all averaged out and tabulated, and the results are pretty interesting. The white bars represent the scores of the unspoiled stories, while the blue represent the spoiled. And rather fascinatingly, in all cases but one, the spoiled version of the story scored higher than the unspoiled. And even the one unspoiled version that did score higher did so with the lowest margin of difference in the entire test. And the exact same experiment was repeated by Christianfield 2 years later with near identical results. It seemed that people were genuinely enjoying stories more spoiled than unspoiled. And I have to say, I was actually pretty shocked by this, and so I wondered if maybe the reading material provided were all stories where the ending wasn't really that important, until I saw that 2/3 of the reading material were made up of shorts belonging to the genres of ironic twist endings or mysteries. And arguably, these are stories whose entire worth is hinged on their unexpected endings. If you want to check this study out for yourself, I'm going to leave a link in the description below. And so, what could possibly account for this? How could it be that rather than spoiling stories, spoilers, adverse to their name, seem to enhance people's enjoyment of them? Well, at this point I was pretty skeptical, so it seemed the only way I could really test this for myself was to actually go find a film that was well known for its unexpected ending, spoil it, and then watch it. And after a brief Google search, I came across the 1995 film The Usual Suspects, and so somewhat reluctantly I pulled up the Wikipedia page and read the plot summary, and then with the vague feeling that I had just ruined for myself a modern American classic, I sat down and watched it. And I really enjoyed it. The Usual Suspects is a good movie. The cast was great, the characters are fun, and the film was generally very well put together and directed. And even when I did reach the ending, I still got a kick out of it despite knowing what was coming. In fact, if I was forced to put an arbitrary numerical value assignment to it, I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Which is interesting because this seems to fall more or less in line with aggregate scores like IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes, which means that my opinion of the film seemed to fall in line with the general consensus, which in turn means that my enjoyment of the film didn't seem to be dramatically altered by the fact that I knew the details of the plot before watching, despite the film being constantly cited as something that would be ruined if you knew the ending. And so, what could account for this? I mean, sure, my homebrewed test is nothing beyond anecdotal, but I think it did give me the context to understand Christianfield's study a little better. And when the two are combined, it starts to paint the rather unusual picture, and that is that while spoilers certainly change our perception of a story, they don't necessarily spoil it. But if this really is the case, then why does it feel so bad when something is spoiled on us? Well, after doing a little research, I came to two distinct answers, and the first can be found in a 2009 study which focused on the cheery topic of emotion and regret. And it was found that the cases that people felt the most intense amount of regret came from not mistakes that had been made in their past, but instead from the perceived loss of future opportunity. And with spoilers, that perceived opportunity loss is the ability to experience a story unspoiled with no prior knowledge of it. And so it could be suggested that the frustration and upset we feel at a piece of media being spoiled isn't necessarily related to how we will actually enjoy said piece of media when we do experience it, but rather how in the moment of the spoil we feel that something has been taken away from us which we can never get back, like the regret I immediately felt after reading the plot summary of The Usual Suspects, despite the fact it didn't seem to affect my actual viewing experience of it. The second reason spoilers feel so bad relates to what I feel is the disproportionate value people place on plot. The simple A to B of a narrative. Character A does this, character B does this, they go to location X, and this happens, etc. And certainly, plot is the easiest part of any narrative media to understand and dissect, meaning that everyone can have a seemingly informed opinion about a story's plot, because everyone is well versed in describing simple narrative events, which leads to the commonly held belief that a film or TV show is its plot. Which is troublesome because plot is also the aspect of media that stands to be most affected by spoilers. But really, if we pull back and think about this, the plot is only really one small aspect of a much larger whole. Let's for argument's sake say that a spoiler ruins a film's plot. Just look at everything else we can still appreciate about it. You can't spoil a well-choreographed action scene or a great character design or a touching piece of acting, because these are all aspects that work on a deeper emotional level than just knowing if something may or may not happen. And I think the logical counter-argument to this is, well, the plot is more important than those things. To which I have to ask, is it? We recently covered possibly my favourite anime, Yu Yu Hakusho, on this channel, and I would say nothing about that show's plot is especially interesting, but rather it's the manner in which it's executed that makes it feel so goddamn special, which is why in a 29-minute video I only spent maybe 40 seconds talking about the show's plot total. And that's not something that's unique to me. Go to any experienced or well-respected media critic, and the discussion of the plot will usually only take up a very tiny portion of their overall review. In fact, one of the biggest pieces of advice I have for anyone making video essays is learn to discuss a piece of media for more than just its core plot, as often this is the least interesting way of explaining the appeal of a film or TV series. None of this is to say that a plot isn't important, but more that what happens in a story is only as important as how it happens. And if you want proof of this, look no further than the FX original series, The People vs. O.J. Simpson. The entire 10 episodes of this show is leading to the moment of whether O.J. Simpson is found innocent or guilty for murder. Every scene of it is intensely focused on the answer to this question, and of course he was found innocent! And if you think I just ruined this show for you, then I need to remind you that this was real-world international news. The entire show was based on the 1995 O.J. Simpson murder trial, a case that utterly dominated American media for nearly an entire year. The NBA Finals were interrupted by it, it was on the cover of Time, there have been dozens of different books written about it, and when, after 10 solid months of coverage, he was found innocent, it made worldwide headlines. And yet despite this, despite the fact that a good 90% of its audience had to have known the show's outcome going in, the series has still been lavished with dozens of positive reviews, currently sitting at a staggering 97% on Rotten Tomatoes. And the reason for this is simple. Regardless of how well versed you are in the O.J. Simpson trial or not, it doesn't change the fact that this is a fantastically written, superbly edited, directed, and acted show, that even with the ending being common public knowledge, it hasn't stopped it being one of the most well-regarded TV shows in recent years. And there's even an argument to be made that the context of knowing the show's ending arguably enhances it, as it lets us concentrate not on the question of whether he'll be found innocent or guilty, but how was it that he was found innocent despite the wealth of evidence that speaks to the contrary, which is arguably what this show is really about. And so, even though OJ is an extreme example of this, it can be argued that what we lose in surprise we often gain in context. Knowing plot details of a show beforehand doesn't necessarily take away from the experience of enjoying it. For example, major spoilers for Silent Hill 2 incoming. I knew from the outset that James murdered his wife Mary, a piece of information that utterly recontextualizes the entire game, and knowing this about James gave me an entirely different perspective on him, making him a far more complicated and troubled character than he first seems. And maybe this did lessen the 30 seconds the revelation took place over later on in the game, but I would also argue that it made the other 8 hours far more enjoyable, as I now had the context to truly appreciate the subtlety of the game's storytelling. And I think it's this aspect of increased context that explains the higher scores from spoiled stories from Christian Fields' study. All this said, however, the reason I included a spoiler warning in that last paragraph is that while I personally have come to the conclusion that a spoiler doesn't dramatically negatively affect our experience of a story, I don't expect everyone to agree, and I do think that people should still have the right to choose how much information they have when approaching a new piece of media. And no part of this video is meant to be advocacy for telling someone information on a piece of media they do not wish to know, as even if spoilers aren't as damaging as they are generally perceived, you are altering someone's perception of a story without their consent, which is a bit of a shitty thing to do. But rather, I think it's up to each individual person to decide how much information they're comfortable knowing going into a new piece of storytelling. And if this video has done anything, I hope it's given you a little more perspective on making that decision for yourself, and to maybe consider that a little context and knowledge needn't be a bad thing, as even if our perception of a piece of narrative changes, a good story is just a good story no matter what angle you view it from. And I don't think that's something you can really spoil. Friends, thank you for joining me today. I understand that this is a bit of a prickly issue, so I fully expect the dislike bar on this one to look like a Sith's lightsaber. But I felt this is a conversation that's been stuck in a rut for some time now, and it needed to be moved along. And so regardless of whether you agree or disagree, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did and would like to help support this channel, then consider heading over to patreon.com/Super Eyepatch Wolf, where for as little as a single $1, you can help keep this channel going. I will of course be back soon with another video, but in the meantime, why not come hang out on the Let's Fight a Boss Gaming podcast, where you can hear us discuss our crippling Persona 5 addictions, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit about hentai. Or come find me on Twitter @EyepatchWolf. Friends, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.